So with limited liability rapidly increasing the size of, like take a factory, for instance, but corporations, do you think that there's an increased importance in unions as a result because someone's voice becomes less important if there's 1,000 workers compared to 10? And therefore, do you think it's okay for corporations to prohibit unions?
The union power actually rose with the rise of the corporation to begin with, yeah? Because now there are more and more workers together working to the same regime, interacting with each other, developing political consciousness. And actually, Karl Marx, while praising the rise of the corporation, also pointed this out. I mean, that with increasing scale of production and increased division of labor and discipline within factories, capitalism is actually creating its own grave diggers, yeah? Workers with class consciousness who know how to organize, how to interact with each other, because they are not isolated artisans working in separate workshops anymore. So the rise of trade unions is actually quite closely related to the rise of the corporation. And this also means that the recent decline in trade unions in, not everywhere, but many countries, is partly explained by the decline of large-scale manufacturing industries. Yeah? Because now more people work in shops and offices. They all work according to their own rhythm. I mean, there's no kind of conveyor belt to force everyone to come at the same time, do the same things. Yeah? So, I mean, the economic structure in the rich countries have changed in such a way that it is more difficult to promote trade unions. Having said that, there are still countries like Iceland, Sweden, Finland. I mean, basically the Nordic countries where the unionization ratios are still hitting 70, 80, 90%. In the US, it's only 10%. Yeah? Also, the sheer scale of unionization doesn't necessarily explain its power, because in Britain and Germany, unionization rate is similar. It's around 25%. But the German trade unions are much more influential because of the co-determination system and other mechanisms. In Japan, unionization ratio is very low. I mean, probably around 10, 15%. But even there, I mean, because companies are more employee-oriented, workers have more power than in America, which has similar rate of unionization. So, yeah, I mean, it's not a simple and direct relationship, but yes, clearly the rise of the corporation and the decline of the corporation with declining manufacturing sector is obviously related to the rise and fall of trade unions.
So I think your last statement there, you pretty much said that the best practice, I think you call it the sort of best practice, is considered the US-UK mode of governance. Obviously, it seems the evidence doesn't really, the empirical evidence doesn't bear that out. So my assumption there would be that the reason why that's considered the best practice is the locality of the dominant hegemonic modes of thought. So whether it's through American, UK academic systems, World Bank, IMF, structured adjustment programs, etc. So would your assessment be congruent with that? And what needs to change if that is the case?
Well, there are two things. I mean, what you said, the soft power, so the ideological influence of the US and UK universities, especially in areas like economics, I mean, and the sort of corporate culture in many countries are affected by their local managers who have studied in Harvard Business School, Chicago Business School. So that soft power dimension is very important, but also the US and the UK have, exactly because they had been the world's economic hegemons, they have exceptionally developed financial sector. So, I mean, of course, the US stock market, for example, is like 30 times bigger than that of South Korea, even though in terms of sheer size of the economy, it's only about 16, 17 times bigger. So UK also has the huge financial market for the size of its economy. So a lot of the investors going around the world are from those countries. And when they go to Sweden, they say, why do you have shares that have 100 votes? You have to abolish that. When they come to Korea, they said, no, this family control is outdated. You have to get rid of these families and appoint outside directors. And so there's real pressure backed up by money, because that these American investors, British investors come with money and say, we want a say. What you are doing is wrong. So it's a mixture of the two. But yes, I think you are very right. This dimension of soft power is also very important, because I know what the World Bank says, what the IMF says, how important they are in some developing countries, because they need the money from these organizations. And you have to listen to them. So yes, while there is real money behind it, this soft power issue is very important.
I'm just trying to get my understanding of something you said very early on, which was essentially that neoclassical economics only sees production as sort of a function of the firm. Is that correct?
What I meant is that the process of production in neoclassical economics is basically understood as a technical relationship that can be captured in a mathematical function. Of course, I'm sure many neoclassical economists would admit that that's not the full representation of the reality, but they see that kind of abstraction doesn't have many serious negative implications, whereas I and Antonio, who developed this with me, and many other economists would point out that no, actually seeing the production process, which is social, political process, knowledge-based, involving innovation and so on, as this mechanical, functional relationship where you put together some factors of production according to some formula, that is quite misleading and needs to change.
Essentially, neoclassical economics would almost eschew any kind of structure or structural component or whatever of society, of governance, of how firms are created or how capital moves, etc. I'm just wondering if there is a disconnect in neoclassical economics between sort of the functions or what they use and the structure below, or whether those are joined in there, and if not,
that's an interesting point. No, actually, both the strength and weakness of neoclassical economics comes from the fact that it starts from minimal assumptions about society. So basically, you first of all don't ask questions about the underlying structure. You believe that the human nature is constant, is rational and self-seeking, and whatever context they are put in, the people will be the same. So, if it's a one-man economy, if you can call it an economy of Robinson Crusoe, if it's, subsistence farmers in Tanzania, if it's American corporate managers, if it's Japanese workers, they're all the same. They're in the end the same kind of human beings, and institutions are just details. So there's that kind of, at the deepest philosophical level, there's that assumption, but also neoclassical economics is not equipped to ask questions about underlying social structure. Because at least as it is today, it operates with this notion of Pareto optimality, which is basically asking whether taking everything as given, taking the underlying distribution of income, wealth, and power as given, are there any policy actions that you can make that will improve social welfare, meaning making some people better off without making anyone worse off. So that's the theoretical focus. I'm not saying that it's wrong, but it's a very particular way of thinking about social improvement. Yeah? Now, to be fair, I mean, even within that framework, there are lots of social reforms that you can make. I mean, it's really up to how you use it. People like Joe Stiglitz or Paul Krugman, they make all kinds of quite substantial suggestions for social reform, but the theory is basically not equipped to question the underlying social order. So, given these two kind of pillars of the theory, A, human nature is constant, rational and selfish. B, you don't ask questions about the underlying distribution of income, wealth, and power. There's only a limited aspect of especially things like production process, which is very political, involving control and power, that you can inquire into from neoclassical point of view. I mean, I'm not saying that there's nothing along the line, but there's the efficiency wage theory and some theories using neoclassical tools, trying to understand this the power relationships within the site of production, but these are very much marginal to the whole theoretical edifice. And I think that as I said earlier, I mean, it's that great economics for understanding market exchange, but it isn't just equipped to understand the production process. So we need to look at other theories for that aspect of the economy.
In regard to the sort of principal agent problem that we touched upon, we said that Germany is quite good for creating these bodies whereby they have worker representatives. I was wondering how the UK fares by comparison, because often we see in the news these big bonuses and things like that that sort of show interest to the worker, the managers.
The UK is at least these days very close to the US. I mean, of course, that the Germans created this co-determination system in the 1950s at the height of the Cold War, when they had to show that it's not just the communist East Germany that cares about workers, but also capitalist West. So, it's got its own history, but comparatively speaking, UK workers basically they lost power in the late 70s and early 80s, with the decline of the manufacturing industry, the rise of Thatcherism, and the spread of more individualistic ideology in the country. Actually, in the case of the UK, the inequality rose most in the 1980s, not in the recent period, like the US. So I mean, they had that turning point earlier, and if you like, overdeveloped financial sector, the influence of this short-term, more shareholder-oriented view of corporate governance has always been very influential in this country. And yes, I mean, unfortunately, compared to countries like Germany and Sweden, is very close to the US model.